Donald Trump has received a big-time endorsement in his quest for the Republican nomination. Former rival Dr. Ben Carson announced his support for the billionaire at a news conference.
The retired neurosurgeon says Trump is not just talk and emphasized how much Trump cares for this country.
Some people said, well, why would you get behind a man like Donald Trump? I'll tell you why. First of all, I've come to know Donald Trump over the last few years. He is actually a very intelligent man who cares deeply about America. There are two different Donald Trumps. There's the one you see on the stage, and there's the one who's very cerebral, sits there and considers things very carefully. You can have a very good conversation with him. And that's the Donald Trump that you're going to start seeing more and more of right now. And some people said, but, well, you know, he said terrible things about you. How can you support him? Well, first of all, we buried the hatchet. That was political stuff. And, you know, that happens in American politics. The politics of personal destruction, all that, is not something that I particularly believe in or anything that I get involved in. But I do recognize that it is a part of the process. We move on because it's not about me. It's not about Mr. Trump. It's about America.
Well, Trump took questions after the announcement. Our Major Garrett was there.
Mr. Trump, do you see Mr. Carson, Dr. Carson, playing a policy role principally for your campaign or as a surrogate out on the campaign trail going places you're not going? And when he says there are two Donald Trumps, do you agree with that characterization? And could you amplify on it?
I probably do agree. I think there are two Donald Trumps. There's the public version, and people see that, and I don't know what they see exactly, but it seems to have worked over my lifetime. But it's probably different, I think, than the personal Donald Trump. I think Ben would say that. Ben said it very well today. So perhaps there are two Donald Trumps. But, well, you know, I'm somebody that is a thinker. I'm a big thinker. And I have my ideas, and they're strong, and, you know, typically they've worked out. And what I want to do is, you know, the theme, and Ben alluded to it, the theme that I have for this entire campaign is Make America Great Again. That's what I want to do. Very simple. I want to make America great again. We have so many problems, whether it's military, whether it's trade, whether it's borders, whether it's terrorism. We have so many problems. The debt. You know, you look at our debt, $19 trillion, going up to $21 trillion in a very short fashion. So we're gonna straighten things out, and we're gonna straighten them out correctly.
Policy or politics for you?
Dr. Carson's both. Dr. Carson is both, but he's going to be very much on policy. Ben was always very strong on policy, and he's going to be very much on policy.
Well, after the announcement, Anne-Marie and I spoke with CBSN political contributor Leslie Sanchez, Harvard professor of government Leah Wright Rigueur, and Major Garrett about the significance.
I think it's a bigger deal for Dr. Carson in the sense that it positions him within the rubric of the Trump campaign, and should he move forward to be the presumptive nominee, as it looks like if he could have big wins in Ohio and Florida, then you know, that's really where candidates start looking. Oh, I'm really jockeying for a cabinet post. I want to be there and show I came in early before that momentum. So I think there's a bit of political maneuvering here. There's a big base of support. I think it will have a halo effect, but not as big as folks would like to believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, Leah, I'll bounce the same question to you. What do you make of this endorsement, and do you think it'll have a positive impact on the Trump campaign?
So I absolutely agree that this is a big boon for Dr. Carson, right? It puts him right in the center of relevancy. He's back in the public eye again after everybody kind of wrote him off. But I'd also like to add that I think that it actually does something for Donald Trump. It brings in the idea that, you know, maybe that he could win black voters. But irrespective of that, it also brings in the idea of a kind of shield for Donald Trump against charges of racism. Now, that may not matter for African Americans or for Latino voters, but for white, moderate, and kind of independent voters, this might be the kind of buffer that they need in order to support somebody like Donald Trump.
And that's an interesting question, Leah. It's something we've been talking about a lot. You know, the Democrats have been charged with sometimes thinking of the black vote as monolithic and always in support of the establishment, which in this case would be Secretary Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders has been making the case that he has always been about civil rights. So does Dr. Carson with Donald Trump now sort of give him a little bit of a buffer against those charges that the people who support him in some cases are less than friendly, let's say, to African Americans.
Well, right. So it gives him a minor buffer, right? So there was a lot of criticism from black people and Latinos of Dr. Carson. So the idea that he would get some kind of huge or enormous bounce amongst black voters is just kind of not really accurate. But what it does do is maybe cut into a certain segment of black voters, conservative black voters, for example, evangelical black voters, for another example. And in fact, in those early polls, Ben Carson was actually doing pretty well amongst black voters for a black Republican, getting about 20%, 19% of the black vote. The other thing that we have to consider is that there are actually black voters who may support Donald Trump, right? They actually echo his position on things like immigration, on the economy, on capitalism and free market enterprise. And so for Donald Trump, there's not going to be this huge avalanche of black support. We're not going to see anything, over 10%. That would be rare. But we may see him actually cut into votes in swing states, for example, Ohio, where African Americans may actually come out in higher numbers than expected.
All right, Leah, stand by. Leslie, stand by as well. We're going to go straight to Major Garrett, who was at Mar-a-Lago. He was in that press conference. Major, the news that you sort of broke is that apparently there are 2 Donald Trumps.
Or not.
Or not, exactly.
Depends
or not, depends on when you ask him.
Tuned in.
Right, it depends on the sequence which the question was asked and then answered and then re-asked and then re-answered. So there was an evolution on that. And the one thing that struck me, well, many things struck me about that, but Donald Trump said, I don't like to spend very much time analyzing myself. I heard George W. Bush say exactly the same thing. In that one respect, I think they share. They are not deeply analytical about their own psychology, their approach to things. But Donald Trump did, for the first time, concede that there is this very brash public persona, and then there is a much quieter, contemplative, thinking side of his personality. And when you talk to people who work in the Trump inner circle, they say he largely gathers information by talking to people, quietly bringing them in, picking their brains, and then turning to his advisors and saying, look, summarize this conversation for me, put it back down in bullet points, and that's how I'll take it. So he's a thinker, he said, but not a huge reader or collector of information in a printed form. What he prefers to do is talk to people, work things through. And like he said about Ben Carson, he foresees for Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson, a role in education and health policy. After doing what? Spending about an hour with him talking about education. So that's how Donald Trump develops his particular perspectives. And then he has this larger than life, which he more or less conceded today, public persona that has a very harsh and tough political side. Like he said, against Ben Carson, it's politics. It's very tough. I had to knock him out. I respected him. I couldn't shake him. He responded to me with strength and silence. It was hard for me to shake him, so I had to knock him out. Now they're together. So you really did see play out in a way that I don't think we have before, Trump explaining to the country that there is, if not a duality, at least a complexity to who he presents on the campaign trail and who he is off the campaign trail, and that might, I emphasize, might provide some insights should he become the Republican nominee or later President of the United States.
All right, well, Leslie, you heard something interesting coming out of Major's mouth there. What do you make of this concept of the 2, but yet not 2?
It's really interesting. It reminds me of a comment that I heard when Donald Trump was first toying with the idea of running for office from the senior producers of The Apprentice. And they would say he would walk into the boardroom or kind of quietly in there, and he would ask all the producers, okay, who do I fire today? And he actually wasn't really engaged in all the different processes, but wanted to hear from the producers what had happened, and then he'd make a decision and kind of based on that. So it was the same kind of surface level information, not really engaged in what the tasks were, and that was a reality show, but it's very indicative, I think, of his style.
I think we lost Major because he has to get back to reporting. Major, thanks so much. We still have Major. Okay, great. So Major, sorry about that.
I'm right here. I'm right here.
You're here.
That was my question. That was my question, Major, is like, which one do you know? I mean, personally, and all the time you've been following Donald Trump, who do you see more consistently?
Well, of course I see the public persona much more consistently. I see Donald Trump at rallies. I mean, we've had one very lengthy interview behind stage in Florida before a large event the Friday before the South Carolina primary. We've had a couple of phone conversations, not extensive. So I don't really have a sense of this inner world of Donald Trump that is cerebral, that is the thinker, that is the builder of ideas and the deployer of resources. What I have had a chance to do is talk to people very close to the Trump world, people who have worked some time for Donald Trump, don't work for him anymore, people who still work for him, and I've tried to build an understanding of those who have spent a good deal of time dealing with Donald Trump before he got into politics and trying to assess his methods then. And what I found is his methods then are sort of what you see behind the scenes in a presidential campaign, because whether you're a Republican who thinks Donald Trump is good for the party or good for the country, what you cannot deny is as a novice, and he is purely a novice in politics at the presidential level, he has succeeded far more than he has failed. Ted Cruz likes to say, well, I've beaten Donald Trump 8 times. As Donald Trump reminded everyone last night, I've beaten you 13 times, Ted Cruz. That's no small feat. And when Donald Trump refers to a large field of 17 Republicans, there was some very formidable Republicans in that field. When it was 17, there are still formidable Republicans in it now. I had a long conversation with his campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, this morning. He said, look, he's on stage against Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, two of the best debaters in the United States Senate, and a sitting governor who spent 18 years in Congress. He's up against the best talent in the country politically, certainly in the Republican Party, and he's holding his own. So what Trump has brought to his personal and his business life, and the various successes and some failures, he's brought to politics. So that part is where I think you get this complexity of the two people, but a similar pursuit and a similar intense focus ultimately on results. Donald Trump is nothing if not devoted to and obsessed with the results he sets before himself and he asks his team to pursue on his behalf. And I think you've seen that to a large extent in his business career, and now you're beginning to see it in his political career.
Major, before we get back to our panel, I want to ask you a question. I know the news of the day is this endorsement from Dr. Carson, but I want to ask you about the protesters and the violence that some have seen at Trump rallies. Our campaign embed for CBS News, Sopan Deb, tweeted out last night that he's been at almost every single rally at the Trump campaign. He has never seen, as Mr. Trump alleges, protesters attacking his supporters. There are people that are saying that, as we've seen in Julianne Goldman's reporting, that Mr. Trump in some cases almost stoked that fire. What do you say?
So I've not been to nearly as many rallies as our excellent embed Deb Sopan has. But the ones I've been to, I've never seen violence by any protester ever. I've seen protesters raise their voice, raise their banners, and be escorted out. And I've never seen anyone punch a protester either. So I would say, in general, these episodes of violence that are extremely intense are far more rare than they are common. But I will say this, and I noticed this from the very earliest time going to Donald Trump rallies, there is a bit of an intensity in the air. There is an edge to them. There is a sense of that the audience is coming to see Trump. They've waited a long time to see it. They want to hear him, and they don't want anyone to get in the way of that. And there have been times, quite clearly, the videotape is there for everyone to see, where Trump does not gently treat those who are protesting his rallies and gives voice to those who might want to hear it, that he is, if not giving them license to rough them up, he's certainly saying it's not unacceptable, that it's maybe permissible in a general sense. Donald Trump is walking a very fine line here, and I would observe as a reporter and as someone who's watched a lot of presidential politics, it is a potentially dangerous line because the rallies are going to continue. The conversation about what Trump means for this country, not just in the Republican Party, but writ large as a potential nominee for the presidency of the United States. And this conversation and the sense of division that possibly Donald Trump sets in motion is going to continue. And the Trump campaign said this morning, look, we have a safe zone outside of our arenas or outside of our venues. Protesters can go there. Look, protesters know to get your message across, you have to be in the arena. You have to be where the candidate is. You have to make your voice heard there. So this is going to play out. And I would suggest today is an excellent example of what may or may not happen and where this continuum we find ourselves. Donald Trump is going to go to Chicago today. Black Lives Matter is an enormously important part of the conversation in that city. It's an enormously important part of that city and its African-American community's relationship to its mayor, Rahm Emanuel, its police department generally. And what Donald Trump does or doesn't do, or what his supporters do or don't do, and what protesters do there will be an interesting insight into where this debate about Donald Trump currently is, the atmospherics of his rallies, and what his own comportment will be about the protest movement against him and how he will deal with it.
Leah, I want to ask you about that as well. You know, over the past couple of days, Donald Trump has been asked about whether or not, in the debate, he was asked whether or not he feels he contributes to the atmosphere at some of his rallies. He said that he hoped not. At this press conference here, he basically suggested, or he accused the most recent protester of actually starting the altercation. What do you make of how he's dealing with these questions? Does he run the risk of not only alienating potential African-American voters, but maybe other people who are just uncomfortable with this?
Absolutely. So the problem that we have here is that Donald Trump is unequivocally denying that he's responsible for the violence or that violence is even happening. And so, and part of this is that he argues that these protesters bring it on themselves just by being there. And so I think it's creating, or it's stoking, and the rest of the panel has done a great job of this, it's really stoking this kind of culture of violence. We've seen it before in 1964 with Barry Goldwater, where protesters and delegates, black delegates, were actually beaten up, were set on fire, were kicked out. And so I really worry, and I'm really concerned about the impact that this will have, especially leading up to the nomination. But absolutely, this is an alienating tactic. And I think he's going to, if he's really serious about winning over at least a small segment of Black and Latino voters, he's absolutely going to have to address it. And he's going to have to address it for those white voters who really are uncomfortable with the idea of violence.
You know, Leslie, that's an interesting point that Leah makes here. And I listened to the debate last night. I listened to Jake Tapper ask Mr. Trump, but also the other candidates running, about the violence that they've seen at some of these rallies. And a lot of them seem to pivot. Senator Cruz pivoted to Barack Obama, saying that it's because he's been a divisive president that you have people that are angry. Sure. Doesn't it make, as a Republican strategist, shouldn't somebody just say the way that John McCain did when he was running for president against Barack Obama, when somebody questioned Barack Obama's legitimacy as an American, as a Christian, and he said, no, ma'am, he's an honorable man, he's a family man, you're not going to say that at my rallies, and he took the microphone away. Why doesn't Donald Trump and the other candidates just say, we shouldn't have that at that? It's wrong. Right.
They're stoking, in some senses, a fire. I think there's a really important thing, and I'm definitely going to tweet this, what Leah and what Major were saying, the culture of violence, and Major saying that he's walking a very dangerous line. I think those are very much warning signs for individuals who watch these rallies. It's kindling, right? And what we want to ensure is this is a public discourse, that a lot of voices heard. Protesters are not new. Barack Obama had them, George W. Bush had them. We all have them. Right. You know, it's a normal part of the process. It's how you deal with it, how you manage it, and inciting any type of acceptability or encouraging any type of acceptability of violence or this type of thing is really not a position, not something a person in a position of authority should be doing. I think we have to be really careful and step back a little bit. And you're right. I think when you think of Senator McCain, when I think of the former chairman of the Republican Party that I worked for, they would never tolerate this type of language. That's not what this is about.
And it's fine, I think, that if you have people protesting, they're disrupting something, that police officers or whoever it is that are organized to do that. But when you see his supporters spitting on protesters, when you see his supporters sucker punching another protester, that's when, and Mr. Trump, as Major points out, seemingly giving them license to do that in some of the comments that he made.
Not only that, denying that it's happening, really. And I mean, we can all see the video. Clearly, this is not happening at other rallies. There's something different going on here.
This is the deal. Is it a pattern that is very suspicious that we can start to daisy chain together? Is it the issue where a reporter says she was, manhandled, so to speak, and has bruises on her arm? No, it probably didn't happen. She's lying. So now you're discrediting the victim, so to speak.
Even though there was another reporter who saw it happen.
Who saw it happen. There's credible, audio evidence and such of the otherwise. There's a videotape showing these kinds of things. It's an ongoing pattern. You add on that the layer and the suspicion a few folks have, more independent voters, on the KKK and the folks, the neo-Nazis who've been encouraged to get involved in the campaign. And going back as far as robocalls in Iowa and New Hampshire, he didn't denounce those. Now, he's certainly not a racist. He's come out and said he doesn't support that. But talk among some of those groups is, yes, go into the campaign offices. You'll find friendly voices. There's too much there. So it becomes critically important to really lay out a framework of what is acceptable and what's not.
I mean, this has got to be of concern to the Republican Party on a whole, not just the way Donald Trump is treating the accusations, but also the way the other candidates were, uncomfortable with the idea of being very critical about it.
This is the deal. I tell you, there's going to be a big contingency within the Republican Party that feels it's politically incorrect.
All right, Leslie Sanchez, Leah Wright Rigueur, thank you both so much for being a part of this. We could keep talking for a long, long time. We appreciate it. And our Major Garrett in Florida, thank you all for joining us.